if AI isn't used thoughtfully, um, things can go wrong. If there aren't good governance practices and there aren't guardrails, mistakes can be made, and those have reputational and other costs, right? But that is the reason why companies, I think, are many of them, particularly companies using industrial AI, are putting in programs internally to try to mitigate those risks. And so there's a lot companies can do as they're going through their AI adoption journey to mitigate those risks.
Today on The Optimistic Outlook, we explore a pivotal question for America's economic future. With a nationwide boom in AI factories, are businesses truly ready to leverage this infrastructure and deploy AI at scale? In this episode, Brie Sachse, Siemens USA's head of government affairs, speaks with one of the foremost leaders in technology policy, Victoria Espinel, president and CEO of the Business Software Alliance. Together, they dig into what it really takes to build trustworthy, responsible AI systems that deliver real value, from data quality and governance to workforce readiness and sector-specific policy. It's a timely, practical look at how technology and policy can work hand in hand to shape a more competitive, innovative future. Let's listen in. Victoria, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
I am so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, look, we're going to dive right in. AI is rapidly evolving, right? Think about, we've moved so quickly from AI as a buzzword and this futuristic vibe to being at the epicenter of everything. But yet organizations struggling in some cases with deployment. So you talk to CEOs, policymakers, global partners around the world. Maybe set the table for us today. What are the forces, what are the motivations driving this surge in AI adoption?
So you're right. There's been this tremendous surge. AI first started, was a major research project back in the 1940s. There's been this evolution. There's been AI winters. There's 1980s. There was kind of a thought that it was going to get commercialized and that kind of, but now I think now it's here to stay. And we have seen this tremendous surge in interest and a beginning of a surge in adoption. But I think going kind of to the core of your question, I think there's a lot of interest, but true effective adoption isn't quite there yet. I think the reason for it, the motivation, is because I think companies, and not just tech companies, I think companies in every industry sector are cognizant of the fact that if they use AI effectively, it's going to help them be more competitive. It's going to help them serve their customers better, and that's what companies want to do. And so I think that is, at its core, that's the motivation behind the interest in AI adoption. But notwithstanding, the surge that we've seen recently, I think there's still a long way to go in terms of companies figuring out how to use AI most effectively.
Right. Well, now I want to follow up. When you think about opportunities, you hit on some of them, right? The benefits of AI from a commercial perspective. There's risks too. I know this is the optimistic outlook, but we're going to keep it real. But tell us, what do we need business leaders to know right now when we're talking AI deployment?
There are three that I would call out. One is, if AI isn't used thoughtfully, things can go wrong. If there aren't good governance practices and there aren't guardrails, mistakes can be made, and those have reputational and other costs, right? But that is the reason why companies, I think, are many of them, particularly companies using industrial AI, are putting in programs internally to try to mitigate those risks. And so there's a lot companies can do as they're going through their AI adoption journey to mitigate those risks. But that is a risk. A second risk is if we end up in a place, and part of BSA's job is to make sure this doesn't happen, where governments have very different approaches and very different sets of rules on how AI is used. I think that is a risk to adoption overall, because that patchwork of rules leads to less clarity, less predictability.
Right.
And as you know, that's what companies want. That's what CEOs want. They want clarity. They want predictability. They want to be able to plan. And so I think a big risk factor out there is if we end up in a place where there are a lot of different rules. I actually think there's reason to be optimistic around that not happening. But that is definitely a risk. And the third one I would say, and I feel like this one doesn't get talked about as much, is I think there's a big risk to companies if their employees don't know how to use AI effectively. So there's all, like
Right.
it's really impossible for companies to be able to use and deploy AI unless their employees understand how to use it and understand why they're using it. And so I think not focusing enough on training and the skill set inside your workforce, I think that is an enormous risk.
And I maybe want to just pull on that thread, double clicking on the workforce. So Siemens, we recently announced a commitment to train 200,000 electrical and manufacturing workers. And from our perspective, we're front and center in what we call lifelong learning. But having that robust training in place and understanding the power of the tools. And I know there's a lot of conversations around replacing workers, and will jobs be lost? Yes, right. But a whole segment of jobs are going to come online using technology. In Fort Worth, we've actually been able to bring employees off the sideline into our factory there using AI, bringing them into new roles on the plant floor. So I do think there's a good model when you think about public, private, but industry, academia, government, right, working together to tackle that digital transition of the workforce to bring everyone along.
I'd love to ask you a question about that, because I know Siemens has been thinking a lot about that, and particularly thinking about how to do it in a way that is inclusive. And that can mean a lot of different things, including geographic inclusivity, and trying to make sure that those skills are as widespread as possible, that they're not sort of isolated in particular tech hubs or particular parts of the world. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how Siemens is thinking about building that workforce and spreading those skills.
Sure. And I'd say not just our own workforce, but for our customers, right, and the communities we operate in. So we have what we call the industrial co-pilot with Microsoft, but that you actually can talk about activating workers, engineers, operators on the plant floor in their native language, using the co-pilot, but communicating perhaps with the engineering hub in another country who's maybe in another native language, but co-pilot can help bridge all of that. So really empowering creativity, productivity, enhancing efficiency there. So a couple different ways I think we're deploying from the Siemens point of view.
The ability for people to be able to speak their own language and then communicate seamlessly with people in another language is tremendous.
So, Victoria, you mentioned regulatory perspectives a little bit when you were going through risks and opportunities and the patchwork. Love to get your perspective, not just from a U.S. and Washington where you all are active, but Brussels and across the globe. When you're looking at the landscape, what are the critical ingredients you see for responsible, trustworthy AI and where we want to see governance?
On the policy dynamic, there's been this big surge of interest in AI adoption. There's been a big surge in interest of governments on regulating AI and thinking about AI, which I think is a good thing. I think it is great that so many governments around the world have recognized that this is a really important moment of technological change and are thinking about what to do to address it. That doesn't mean I necessarily agree with every approach that governments are taking, but I think the focus from policymakers is good. And I think there's a real genuine interest that policymakers have in trying to learn more about. And we see that in the United States, but we see that in Europe, we see that across Asia, we see that around the world. I think one of the approaches that we are in favor of and that we've seen a lot of governments move towards is what we call a risk-based approach. And in essence, what that means is if you're thinking about how to regulate AI and you're thinking about what companies should be doing with respect to their either creation or use of AI, take into account the amount of risk that is being created. There are different sorts of risks that are involved. You're using AI to, blur your background in a video conference, or you're using AI to draft an email versus if you're using AI for a worker safety issue, for example.
Right.
So having governments sort of recognize that AI, there's lots of different kinds of AI. It can be used in lots of different ways, and that the regulation should be tailored appropriately to the level of risk, I think is very important. And we have seen more and more governments move towards that type of approach. So I think that is very, I think that is good. There's some variability underneath that. So we're certainly not at a harmonized approach, but we have seen governments start to move towards that approach. And then I think the second thing is making sure that AI regulation reflects the roles and responsibilities that different companies have. So you have companies that are creating AI, you have companies that are using AI, you have companies that are doing both.
Right.
And there's actually then lots of sort of gradations along that spectrum.
Right.
And so having government regulations recognize what companies are actually doing and what they can be responsible for, I think is very important.
I'd love to put maybe another approach that honestly Siemens is supportive of, and we share the view, but the context of how the AI is being used. And you already hit on the view of industrial AI, right? And so the applications of that very different in a manufacturing environment versus consumer-facing AI applications. So talking a little bit more about a sector-informed approach, what's your view on that? Kind of what would that look like?
So I think it makes a lot of sense to have a sector approach for exactly the reasons that you said. Different companies, there are different types of AI. Companies are going to be doing different things with AI. So having an approach that's tailored to a sector, I think makes a lot of sense. But I think it also needs to be context specific. Even within a particular sector, AI is being used in different ways. So the context still matters. Our view is that having sort of a general horizontal framework and then having vertical applications underneath it is what makes sense. So the NIST framework as an example of something that can serve sort of a horizontal framework that applies to every industry sector, but then having underneath that vertical applications that are relevant to manufacturing or industrial AI or financial services, for example. We feel like it will avoid the patchwork by having a framework that applies across the board, but then those vertical applications will make sure there's enough flexibility and that the rules are tailored to what companies are actually doing.
We saw recently the administration rolled out Mission Genesis, taking this whole of government approach in harnessing science data. Love to talk about a cornerstone related to Siemens' approach on AI, which is AI is only going to be as powerful as the data behind it. So seeing the data effort coming out of the administration on Mission Genesis, we talked about industrial AI, that need for a ton of data in the manufacturing environment, but we've got a high threshold for the requirements of the security of that data. What do we need policymakers to understand in terms of data in order to successfully scale AI?
So you're absolutely right. And one of the things we need to make sure is that policymakers understand how important high quality data is to AI. And I think that understanding is coming. I think there are two things I would say specifically. One is, and you I think are maybe already aware of this, but BSA has put together adoption agendas for governments. We actually launched here in the United States in July, just before the White House put out its AI action plan. We launched in Japan and Singapore in September. We just launched in India as part of the lead up to Modi's AI Impact Summit. And there are three main pillars. Pillar number 2 is data and infrastructure. And we decided to put data in the infrastructure pillar because essentially it is the infrastructure of AI. I think there are at least two things that I would mention. One is governments have a lot of data, and making it possible for companies to be able to access high quality public data is very important. I think the United States actually has, as you just pointed out, that's something this administration has been focused on. So I think that's very helpful, but we'd love to see governments around the world working on making the data that they have available to the public. So that's high quality, access to high quality public data sets. And the second is cross-border data. So you talked before, you had this great example about Siemens having products that allow engineers in different countries to be able to talk to each other in their own language. That is only possible in a world where data can move relatively easily back and forth across borders.
Right.
And so as important as data is to AI, cross-border data is the essence of that. And if there are a lot of restrictions on cross-border data, that's going to make effective AI adoption impossible. So access to public data sets and support for cross-border data are two very important fundamentals for policymakers to keep in mind.
I know we hit on workforce a little bit, but would love to hear a little bit more about software.org, your efforts there, and maybe connect to what are the skills we're going to need for an AI-enabled workforce? And then also, what do we think we need from government to help support, and industry to support that digital transformation as we bring people along?
So I think there's nothing more important to AI adoption than workforce and training. In fact, in the AI adoption agenda that I just mentioned, the first pillar is workforce and development. Because, as I said before, companies are not going to be able to use AI effectively unless their employees know how to use it effectively. So that is very, very important. And, I think there's still too big a gap between those who know it's important to use AI and those who know how to use AI effectively. I think a lot of the responsibility of that falls on companies, and it should, to train their own workforce. But I think it would be very helpful for government to be a partner there as well. Certainly, we've seen the White House recently launch an education initiative, having governments around the world focus on providing or supporting private entities that are offering training to their employees on AI is very important. There's sort of AI training and literacy that could happen at a very high general level. But for it to really be effective, it has to be tailored to what the employee is actually going to do. And that is a sort of a second layer of, I won't say complication, but that is a more detailed analysis and preparation than doing the first layer. So I think having general AI literacy training for the population is great. I think that's essential, and you want people to get comfortable with the tools. But if a company is really going to use it effectively, they are going to need to tailor that training to how their employees are actually using it. And so I think being thoughtful about that is very important.
Absolutely. And I'll say I've been really proud. Siemens, we at multiple of our factories over the years have engaged. I mentioned that partnership around industry, academia, government, but where we've partnered locally in communities, whether it's been community colleges, we've had some retired faculty that we actually brought in to help build out curriculum for hands-on training, but to take to that next level, on a production line. So not just the high level literacy. And another piece to that is not just our own workforce, but the communities we operate in. Siemens digital industry software business, we have basically our digital twin technology. We bring it into engineering or vocational schools and embed it into the curriculum in hubs where our customers are. So as they're actually recruiting the talent pipeline, they're already graduating with the skills and the training on that industry AI-powered software.
Oh, that's fantastic. And taking that treaty to where your customers are is going to help spread the geographic diversity of the benefits that are coming from AI. So that is fantastic.
Yes, very, very proud of that. Victoria, let's switch gears. We're going to move to a lightning round. Ask you a couple quick questions, short answers, first thing that comes to your mind. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. If you could wave a magic wand and implement one AI action globally, and you could implement it tomorrow, what would it be?
Be getting governments to focus on getting the workforce trained for the AI future. I don't think there's anything more important than that.
What's the single most exciting opportunity related to AI that could make a positive impact on society?
I think disaster prediction and disaster recovery. I come from, I have deep ties to Louisiana, so it may be part of the reason I feel that so much. But I think we're seeing amazing things happen in AI in terms of being able to predict earthquakes, floods, other kinds of disasters, being able to predict them, get people out of the way, and then help with disaster recovery. That is something AI is already starting to make a difference in. I think that's tremendous.
Now, if you could have AI take over a task from your plate, one thing, what would you choose and why?
Picking out my outfits in the morning so I don't have to think about it.
Love it. You've been a leader of global AI, leading digital transformation for decades. As we enter this next chapter of AI and innovation, what makes you optimistic about the future?
I've never seen governments as willing to work together on an issue as I have on understanding AI and coming to a common approach. It's an unusual thing to have this surge of interest and the surge of wanting to work together. We've seen it in these global summits that heads of states have been organizing, and that makes me very optimistic for the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was great to be here.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Optimistic Outlook. Be sure to tune in for more conversations with leaders shaping technology for a better tomorrow. Please subscribe to The Optimistic Outlook wherever you listen to your podcasts, and be sure to share the podcast with a friend or colleague.